Okay. Okay, so hi. Russia and other communist nations versus the US. So these are tensions that are still pretty prevalent um, today. Um, in this day and age, I think I've mentioned this probably was going over the governments and economies. Sorry about recording these in order. Okay, so the Cold War. It's a state of political hostility between countries characterized by threats, propaganda, and other measures short of open warfare. The state of political hostility that existed between the Soviet bloc countries and the US led Western powers from 1945 to 1990. So it's mostly a conflict between Russia and the US, or capitalism versus communism, in which both countries fought each other indirectly through other countries, and they never actually exchanged direct fire between both countries, hence the Cold War. In the US, during the time, instead of just having a fire drill, they had drills to practice if the Russians attacked the US. There was also a lot of propaganda that made Americans fearful of communism and anything remotely similar. And it caused there to be fear of Russians of like what they will do, what communism like. We, like if they're not like us, they are bad, they're evil kind of thing. It's like, oh, okay. They don't believe in capitalism like that we do, so they must be taken down. Sounds like a lot of what America does. Anyways, let's go. So here we actually have a lot of political cartoons that are made during this time, propaganda, just to kind of show how there's this rivalry between both nations and how they're the enemy and how America needs to defend themselves. So it's like here we have it's like the U.S. and Russia had a battle of who could build the biggest and strongest weapons and military. There were always high tensions, and either country pushing the doomsday button and letting all hell set loose. And there been a full blown atomic war, and it's seen in movies like Red Dawn from 1984, which shows what could have happened if the Russians attacked the U.S. and took over. Um, I was a communist for the FBI, which shows covert affairs in which spies tries to gain Russian secrets to save the U.S. Duck and Cover, which shows how a family could save itself from an attack from Russia, and Doctor Strangelove, which depicts what will happen if the wrong person presses the doomsday button and what the consequences may be in a very comedic way, but it's to show and instill this fear in the U.S. of how, like it says in the bottom right corner picture, it says communism is America's mortal enemy, and it just kind of went on. Like here we have a big political cartoon. We have it says I can build anything you can build better, bigger. No, you can't. Yes, I can. Then I'll build more of them. So we got Uncle Sam and we got a Soviet leader, and it's like kind of like, oh no, whatever you can do, I can do better. And it's like atomic gases, anything, missiles, and even meant rockets, so they can go to space. It's like it was just a huge war of who was bigger, stronger, bully in like the schoolyard. And here's like a little bit more propaganda, which was instilled, which was created to instill fear in people, and how communism must be stopped, and because it's everybody's job to stop communism, and how its socialism is throttling the country. Um, and it kind of came to the point where people were accusing their neighbors of being communists or their bosses. They didn't like how their boss treated them. Maybe they thought their boss wasn't paying them fairly. It's like, oh, my boss is a communist. He has communist or socialist ideals, or especially professors in colleges were being accused of being communists or being sympathetic to communism and socialist ideals. And it was a good time where everybody kind of was blaming each other, had fear, and people were trying to get arrested, killed, or ostracized by society because they were like, oh, they're communists, so like we shouldn't talk to them. And we see the next slide. And here's like some more like, is this tomorrow? America's under communism. Like, and it shows fear of how like they're just gonna attack us, hurt us, kill us, and America's gonna be in flames. Or how the red iceberg, how this is after the Titanic, right? So again, fear. They're kind of going with people's what they know, and they know that during the Titanic they ran into an iceberg, it sunk the ship. So here, USA is the ship, and the iceberg is the communist countries. So it's like they're an obstacle in our way. They're trying to bring us down with them, kind of thing. And so it's still that fear. Um, Here, so it's like the American people are free. They're able to shake your hand, but the Soviet people are in handcuffs or in shackles. Like they have um, no freedom, no say. Or how we have like the American leaders and the Russian leaders sitting on rockets because they're trying to be the first country in space, the first country to land on the moon. And here it's like it's kind of showing like come to the Liberty Hotel where you should have freedom, you should have capitalism, and there's Truman right there. But then trying to entice other countries to kind of join them, join us on the capitalized side. Like, no, join the light side. And then they're trying to say that Russia's the dark side. Star Wars fans out there. That's what they're trying to say here. And then it's the pension ruse. And a lot of times in Russia with capitalism, they go say stuff like, oh, you know, you work hard enough, you're able to have a pension plan and be able to like vacation in one of these country homes. But really, it was only for the super rich because while communism was like ideal, like in the sense of everything being equal, there was still a lot of flaws within it, in which the rich or the more influential people were able to abuse more and take advantage more of the situation than those who weren't. So the pension ruse, because that was the ruse, they're like, oh, you know, be happy. You're gonna have a pension plan. You'll be able to have a vacation if you work hard enough. But it's like it was just to kind of get them to work harder, and there was like never a reward at the end. Um, and then like the United Nations, it's also like France, like the U.S. and like the U.K. kind of saying like, hey, the Iron Curtain because it it divided West and East Berlin. And it was like on the east side it was communism, with west it was capitalism, free market kind of the idea. So then it's like the U.S., Britain, and France has tried. They couldn't do it, so they're like, so the United Nations like, hey, you try it. Like we couldn't do it, you can try it. Nothing's really seems to be working. Communism is spreading on a large scale. So now, thanks to like Stalin, fear of communism is spreading, and it's communism itself is spreading, um, and it's just beyond the borders of Russia. And it's spreading to different countries. Like I've mentioned it, I believe, in the economies videos. There's like China, Czechoslovakia, Slovakia, Cuba, Vietnam, both North and South. There's North Korea, um, Nicaragua, Venezuela, uh, Madagascar, Laos. All these countries are having. Oh yeah, here we go. I have it right here. Sorry. So it's like, and there's like diverse ideologies. There's nuclear weapons are being mass produced. There's tension between both countries due to the U.S. not seeing Russia as a true international power, and Russia representing the U.S. late entry into World War II, which had led to the death of tens of millions of Russians. So it's like a lot of things kind of causes this tension, but According to historians, the causes of the Cold War were tensions between the two nations, like I said, um, the emergence of nuclear weapons and the fear of communism in January 21st, 1924, when Lenin died at the age of 54 of a stroke, and Joseph Stalin, who had served as Lenin's general secretary, eventually took over official rule of the Soviet Union until his death in 1953 from a brain hemorrhage. He industrialized the country through a state controlled economy, but it led to famine. Under his regime, detractors were deported or imprisoned in labor camps, and as part of the Great Purge, 1 million people were executed under Stalin's orders. From 1940 to 1979, communism is established by force or otherwise in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Yugoslovakia, Poland, North Korea, Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, China, Tibet, North Vietnam, Guyana, Cuba, Yemen, Kenya, Sudan, Congo, Burma, Angola, Benin, Cape Verde, Laos, Cambodia, Madagascar, Mozambique, South Vietnam, Somalia, Seychelles, Afghanistan, Grenada, Nicaragua, and many others. So it's spreading, and the U.S. didn't like it. They didn't like how so many people, so many countries were adopting communist ideals and beliefs. Especially, they didn't like it when it was getting closer and closer to home in countries like Cuba, in Nicaragua. Like there was like they thought it was just too close to home to be safe. So the Cold War begins. It went on from 1947 to 1991, and there was allies no longer. Russia and the U.S. they fought in the World War One on the same side and World War Two on the same side. But once World War Two ended, it was like nope, opposite sides again, because the Russians blamed the U.S. for entering the war late and 10 million Russians dying because of that. That's what they think. If the U.S. joined earlier, not as many Russians would have died in the war. In 1950, a National Security Council report known as the NSC 68 has echoed Truman's recommendation that the country use military force to contain communist expansionism anywhere it seemed to be occurring. To that end, the report called for a fourfold increase in defense spending, and unprecedented arms buildup occurred. So, American officials encouraged the development of atomic weapons like the weapons that had ended World War II. Thus began a deadly arms race. In 1949, the Soviets tested an atom bomb of their own. In response, President Truman announced that the United States will build an even more destructive atomic weapon, the hydrogen bomb, or super bomb. Stalin followed suit. So this is just like it's kind of like well, like the political cartoon we saw in the couple states ago. It's anything you can build, I can build bigger. I can build it better, stronger, or I can build more of them. Um, so on May 9th, 1945, the USSR declares victory over Nazi Germany in World War II with Japan's defeat. Korea becomes divided into the Communist North, which the Soviets occupied, and the South, which had been occupied by the United States. March 12, 1947, President Harry S. Truman addresses Congress in what would become known as the Truman Doctrine, calling for the containment of communism and later leading to U.S. entry into wars in Vietnam and Korea to provide defense from communist takeovers. The doctrine becomes the basis for America's Cold War policy. March 5th, 1946, Great Britain Prime Minister Winston Churchill makes his famous Iron Curtain speech in Missouri, alerting Americans to the division between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. October 1st, 1949, following a civil war, China's Communist Party leader Mao Zedong declares his creation of the People's Republic of China, leading the United States to end diplomatic ties with the People's Republic of China for decades. On July 5th, 1950, leading United Nations forces, the first U.S. troops engaged in the Korean War after communist North Korea invaded South Korea with the intent of creating a unified communist state. The war would last until July 27, 1953, with North Korea, China, and the United Nations signing an armistice agreement. And that's why we still have, it's just like a treaty. It's kind of like a treaty. Neither side actually won the war. It's just like, okay, North Korea stays in North Korea, South Korea stays in South Korea. North Korea stayed as a authoritarian, totalitarian government to this day. It's a communist country, and then there's South Korea, which is a more capitalist, free market, mixed economy kind of economy and government system. We have like a prime minister, and it's a more diplomatic bureaucracy, democracy. Um, so there's still the divide where there's still like the DMZ, the demilitarized zone in between, like that kind of like marks the like it's divides both countries from each other. Both countries have guns basically facing each other, saying like if once like somebody steps foot this way, the side can attack, and then whenever the side steps foot this way, the side can attack, kind of thing. Um, it's very regulated. So there are a lot of North Korean defectors who would escape North Korea and try to make it to the South Korean side of the border. A lot of times they're killed because there's a landmine still from the war and etc. And just like the stuff that they've added over the years as security and defense. Once they make it to the U.S., I mean not the U.S. Once they make it to the South Korean side of the border, they have diplomatic immunity. Like they can't be. They have to make it to Seoul first. Actually, they have to make it to the capital, and once they make it to the capital, then they're kind of it's like safe. Um, I mean, of course, it can still probably be extradited, but it's in extreme cases. But once they defected, and it's kind of like okay, well, it's kind of like technically nobody can defect, but then if they make it to the capital, it's like okay, fine. It's kind of like cheat sheet. It's kind of like it's kind of like I can't even think of the word, but yes, it's like not something that they plan for, but it's just something that happens if they manage to make it to the capital. So communism wins in Cuba and Vietnam. So here it's like communism in China started with little to no American involvement, and like communism found in Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba. In Korea, it was a treaty between the North, South, and the U.S. that allowed there to be a peace in which the country was divided in half, and communist ideals stayed in the North. Despite America's best efforts, that wasn't the case in Cuba or Vietnam. People were being drafted for a war that many didn't want to fight in. People protested the war all across the world and in the US. People lit themselves on fire in protest and on Capitol steps. Um, they did hunger strikes. Anything you could probably think of, they did. They had like, marches, and the soldiers themselves didn't want to fight most of the time, but they didn't have a choice. So there was a counselor at San Diego High when I was there. He fought in the Vietnam War, and he said it was either go to jail for a misdemeanor or fight in the war. He said that, do I want to go to jail? I'll have freedom. Technically, I'm going to war. He didn't think anything of it. He's like, sign me up for war. Basically, he's like, prison, war. He's like, eh. It was like, because at that time there was a lot of propaganda saying like, oh yeah, we're winning the war. This is great. This is what we're supposed to be doing as Americans and stopping communism. And there was like a lot of messages that the U.S. is winning in Vietnam. That wasn't the case. And then he's like, when he came back, he was actually disrespected a lot of times. And it's like, because of these, but it's like soldiers sign away their freedom to the government. So it's like, the soldiers themselves didn't have a say or choice in fighting in the war. Most of the time, we were like who they fought with, but people still kind of treated them poorly when they came back home after the war. But despite all of this, though, around this time in China, its young people decided to revolutionize their government, and it was a bloody massacre in Tiananmen Square. But let me see. Let me just kind of go over Cuba real quick and Vietnam. So as this is going on, communism starts to spread. On January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro overthrows the corrupt Fulgencio Batista regime, and Cuba becomes a communist state. April 25th, 1976. Following the fall of Saigon, at the end of the Vietnam War, South Vietnam's capital is seized by communist forces. A few months later, in July, the nation is reunified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam under communist rule. October 25th, 1983, the United States invades Grenada under orders of President Ronald Reagan to secure the safety of American nationals under the country's communist regime, led by Prime Minister Maurice Bishop. The pro Marxist government was overthrown in about a week. June 4th, 1989, after weeks of protest, the Communist Chinese government sends in its military to fire on demonstrators calling for democracy in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. The bloody violence ends in hundreds to thousands of deaths. No official death toll was ever released. Um, it was intense. It's still intense there, or at least it was 6 years ago. Um, so this is Tiananmen Square. So the collage on the left are just pictures I've found online of this, and it's the plaza that leads into the Forbidden City, and it's the turn from an emperor-led state to a communist one. So this is like their Washington D.C. kind of thing. It's like if you go to like the Capitol or like the Lincoln Memorial, stuff like that. If you go there and if you do protest there, because that's what they kind of did here. And on the collage on the right are there pictures I took while I was there, and there's a lot of military officers and police officers kind of walking around in like groups around the square. And then I'm not sure if you guys can see, but like here they have like these right here. Well, these over here were buses, but like, right here, this was like a tank, and they also had like those like missiles and stuff, and that's Tiananmen Square. Like this was public. This was summer of 2015. It was like July. It was hot. It was humid. It was muggy, but it was kind of surreal being there and just kind of seeing that, and how where I'm standing is where hundreds if not thousands of people were killed, um, just because like there was like no real documentation of how many were there. But like at first, like they had stuff where like no, they were just sitting on both sides kind of thing, just kind of facing each other, but then kind of just turned violent. This one right here is pretty like got a lot of international attention, like on the news outlets and stuff. This right here, you can barely see it, is a person. He's just crossing the street, and it's just like it kind of showed how powerful it was, like that photo, and it made it to news coverages everywhere. It was like a reporter who took it. Um, but yes, it was a really intense time, but here it goes. So the Tiananmen Square protests were student-led demonstrations calling for democracy, free speech, and a free press in China. They were halted in a bloody crackdown known as the Tiananmen Square Massacre by the Chinese government on June 4th and 5th, 1989. Pro-democracy protesters, mostly students, initially marched through Beijing to Tiananmen Square following the death of Ho Yongban Ho, a former Communist Party leader who worked to introduce democratic reform in China. In mourning Hu, the students called for a more open, democratic government. Eventually, thousands of people joined the students in Tiananmen Square, with the protest numbers increasing by the tens of thousands by mid-May, which then caused martial law to be declared. And on May 13th, a number of the student protesters initiated a hunger strike, which inspired other similar strikes and protests across China. As the movement grew, the Chinese government became increasingly uncomfortable with the protests, particularly as it disrupted a visit by Prime Minister Mikhail Gorbachev of the Soviet Union on May 15th. A welcome ceremony for Gorbachev was originally scheduled for Tiananmen Square, was instead held at the airport. Although otherwise his visit passed without incident, even so, feeling the demonstrations needed to be curtailed, the Chinese government declared martial law on May 20th, and 250,000 troops entered Beijing. By the end of May, more than 1 million protesters had gathered in Tiananmen Square. They held daily marches and vigils, and images of the events were transmitted by media organizations to audiences in the United States and Europe. Tiananmen Square massacre. While the initial presence of the military failed to quell the protests, the Chinese authorities decided to increase their aggression. At 1 a.m. on June 4th, Chinese soldiers and police stormed Tiananmen Square, firing live rounds into the crowd. Although thousands of protesters simply tried to escape, others fought back, stoning the attacking troops and setting fire to military vehicles. Reporters and Russian diplomats that day estimated that hundreds to thousands of protesters were killed in the Tiananmen Square massacre, and as many as 10,000 were arrested. Leaders worldwide, including Gorbachev, condemned the military action, and less than a month later, the United States Congress voted to impose economic sanctions against China, citing human rights violations. So, so a lot of time in China, it's kind of you see Mao Zedong everywhere, and I mean everywhere. This right here, I bought this at a gas station. It's like a medallion of just kind of like honor, kind of memorial for him. I bought it for a teacher at San Diego High who kind of got me into liking history from World War I to like the Cold War. That's what I'm really history wise. And he had like a Mao Zedong statue and like a pillowcase that other students have given to him over the years as well. When they've gone to China, they just bought it for him, and that's what I bought. Brought him back, and it's just everywhere. Kind of like these images are kind of show the unification of China. How it's like he came to be. How he's like he was a poor man who had strong leadership skills and kind of progressed and moved up and became the dictator of China. And it just these are pictures I've taken at the museum in Beijing, across the street from Tiananmen Square. Um, so during the time where like everything was going on in China and stuff, there's like the Red Scare, which was happening here in the U.S. In which anything suspicious was seen as being communist. People were accusing their neighbors, coworkers, bosses, and etc. to be of being communist sympathizers. So it was how communism was brought to the U.S. in another way, in a sense. So it was in 1947 when the House of Un-American Activities Committee, the HUAC, brought the Cold War home. The committee began a series of hearings designed to show that communist subversion in the United States was alive and well. And because of this, in Hollywood alone, more than 500 people lost their jobs and for decades afterwards couldn't find a job in Hollywood because they were trialed and seen as being communist sympathizers. So, in Hollywood, the HUAC forced hundreds of people who worked in the movie industry to renounce left wing political beliefs and testify against one another. More than 500 people lost their jobs. Many of these blacklisted writers, directors, actors, and others were unable to work again for more than a decade. How HUAC also accused State Department workers of engaging in subversive activities. Soon, other anti communist politicians, most notably Senator Joseph McCarthy from 1908 to 1957, expanded this probe to include anyone who worked in the federal government. Thousands of federal government employees were investigated, fired, and even prosecuted. As this anti communist hysteria spread throughout the 1950s, liberal college professors lost their jobs. People were asked to testify against colleagues, and the loyalty oaths became commonplace. So it was like And again, a lot of this also spread through the movies where we watched during those times. Not that I was alive, but like that a lot of people watched or have seen some of these films in my history classes, and it was just an intense fear. It was just like, anything remotely socialist or communist standing is just bad. It was taboo. It's like you even thought it, you're going to be prosecuted, you'll lose your job, lose your friends, be like a social outcast. Um, so then there's also like this like divide, like socially, yes, economically, but then there was also a physical divide, and that was like at the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall, after World War II, Berlin was divided into four Allied occupational zones. The Soviet zone was in red, which became known as East Berlin shortly after the Second World War in 1945. The Berlin Airlift, 1940 to 1949, was the landmark event that most dramatically signaled the growing divide between the Soviets and the other Allies, which in turn divided post Hitler Germany. So France had the blue part, the UK had the green part of the map, and the US had the yellowish orange. And the rest was um, Soviet. So along here, where you have the divide, like this marker, I'm kind of tracing it with a mouse. Um, that became the Berlin Wall. The east side of the wall, which was the side. Wait, yeah, the side. Sorry, I know my geography. This side of the wall, which is the east side, is was known as being communist area, and then the west, which was the Western hemisphere, the Western um, culture, was the free side. So the Berlin Wall was a guarded concrete barrier that physically and ideologically divided Berlin from 1961 to 1989. Construction of the wall was commenced by the German Democratic Republic on the 13th of August 1961. The wall cut off West Berlin from surrounding East Germany, including East Berlin. The Berlin Wall divided families who found themselves unable to visit each other. Many East Berliners were cut off from their jobs. West Berliners demonstrated against the wall, and their mayor, Willy Brandt, led the criticism against the United States, who they felt had failed to respond. Yeah, the U.S. gets blamed a lot throughout history. It's mostly their big brother ideology. It is what it is. So here's a timeline of. Let me see if I can move this over here. There. Wait. And that should be fine. Okay, so the timeline. So May 8th, 1945, World War II is over and Berlin is divided into four sectors: Americans, French, British, and Soviets. June 23rd of 1948, the currency reform in Berlin. Berlin is divided into two different currency zones. June 24th, 1948, begin of the Berlin blockade. June 25th of that same year, so the next day, the Berlin airlift begins. May 12th of 1949, end of the Berlin blockade, and then May 24th of that same year, Federal Republic of Germany is founded, which is West Germany. Um, continues to September 30th of 1949, end of the Berlin airlift. October 7th, 1949, German Democratic Republic is founded, which is the East German side. May 26, 1952, border between East and West Germany and between the East Germany and West Berlin is still open. November 14th, 1953, the Western powers waive their interzone pass. The Soviet Union follows, but East German citizens need permission to travel to the West. Sorry, I've been speaking all day recording these. So, December 11th, 1957, leaving East Germany without permission is forbidden, and violations are prosecuted with prison up to 3 years. August 13, 1961, the Berlin border between East and West Berlin is closed. barriers are built. 1914, August 14, 1961, Brandenburg Gate is closed. August 26, 1961, all crossing points are closed for West Berlin citizens. June 26, 1961, President John F. Kennedy visits Berlin and says, Ich bin ein Berliner. That means I am a Berliner. He's from Berlin. Like he stands with them. Like he's united with them. So December 17th, 1963, West Berlin citizens can visit East Berlin for the first time after more than 2 years. September 3rd, 1971, Four Powers Agreement over Berlin. June 12, 1987, President Ronald Reagan visits Berlin and urges Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. September 10th, 1989, Hungarian government opens border for East German refugees. November 9th, 1989, Berlin Wall is open. And December 22nd, Brandenburg Gate is opened. October 3rd, 1990, Germany is reunited. So this is like an image of kind of like showing how like the Berlin Wall, Berlin Wall and Soviet Union dissolves. Um, but this wasn't the only issue. Uh, Conflict during this time. There was also the race to space, in which both sides, both the Russians and their like allies, and like the U.S., were just fighting to get to space. Everybody wanted to be the first one in some way or form to get to space, or be the first one to the moon as well. Oh, actually, let's go back here real quick. I had some notes. So on November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall that separated communist East Berlin from democratic West Berlin for nearly 30 years falls. The years 1989 to 1990 see the collapse of communist regimes in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Poland, Romania, Benin, Mozambique, Nicaragua, and Yemen. December 25th, 1991, with the resignation of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union is dissolved. New Russian President Boris Yeltsin bans the Communist Party. Communism soon ends in Afghanistan, Albania, Angola, Congo, Kenya, Yugoslavia, and other nations. China, Cuba, Laos, Vietnam remain under communist rule. North Korea remains nominally communist, although the North Korean government doesn't call itself communist. What? They don't call themselves communist. Okay, now we can go to the racist space. So there's gonna be an assignment for you guys to be doing. Not sure if you guys are gonna be watching it the same day you watch this video or the day after. That should be remain to be seen. Where it will be going more in detail about like who went to space first. Was it like I believe it was Russia sent a monkey. Um, who sent something to space first, like something a living creature who actually made it to space first, and then it's like, well, who made it right after, who, and it's like every time it's like they did one step further. They went a little bit further the next time. Let's say the U.S. made it to like the atmosphere, Russia made it to the atmosphere with a monkey. If like if that exploded, but then it's like the U.S. would then send a monkey who came back down. So it's like it was like very hierarchical. But here we go. Next slide. So here we go. It's like the brief history: humans in space. 1957. It was the Soviets. First satellite launched. 1961. It was the first human in space. It was again from Russia. Uh, Russia again, 1965, first human spacewalk. But then 1969, that's when the U.S. planted the flag on the moon. 1968, this is not Soviet Russia, but it's Russia and the U.S. First modules launched to begin construction of the International Space Station. So we have what we have now in space because of this. We have a a lot of great achievements were made during this time, but it was mostly out of trying to prove their power and how much more powerful and strong their country was. So the space race was a 20th century competition between two Cold War adversaries, the Soviet Union and the United States, to achieve superior spacelift capability. It had its origins in the ballistic missile based nuclear arms race between the two nations following World War II. Who won the space race? By landing on the moon, the United States effectively won the space race that they had begun with Sputnik's launch in 1957. For their part, the Soviets made four failed attempts to launch a lunar landing craft between 1969 and 1972, including a spectacular launch pad explosion in July 1969. So technically, even though the Russians sent something to space first, they sent the first human to space and had the first human spacewalk. The U.S. won the race because they were actually able to land on the moon. So, I mean, technicalities. But, okay, that's the end of this presentation, though.